start, who's expecting the same talk as last year? Anybody? I know a couple people in the audience were. Okay, Matt, stand up. The Agile Security talk this year will be given by Matt Conda tomorrow. So go to his talk tomorrow, it'll be great. Okay, let me get started. This is the obligatory slide. You know, RJS is the reason I'm here, so they have to be put up on the screen. Ta-da! Short firm, they're the company that gave me the chance to create the security consulting company of my dreams. And if you want to know more, come see me. Done with marketing. Let me introduce myself. This is me. As you can see, I've been doing this for a while. And this is what I do. You're going to see this a lot, because unlike other talks, this is a talk about language. This presentation is coming from a paper that's not yet published. I'm working on a gold paper for one of my standard certifications. And it's a paper on the use of metaphor with an incident response. Hopefully it'll be coming out next month, but my editor has not responded to me in the last week, so maybe not. But fundamentally, the presentation is about language. It's about how language informs our thoughts, and how our thoughts form language, and over time, what that means for us as people and us within the security community. Fundamentally, it's about a talk about how language is reality. My hope is this talk will not take the entire slot, and there'll be time for free-form discussion at the end, but we'll see how it goes. This is the first time I've given it. The fundamental point is that in security, we tend to communicate with too little attention given to our audience. We often agree what individual words mean, but complex ideas take time to explain. Concepts are built upon concepts, which are built upon concepts. Looking at this generationally, it goes back thousands and thousands of years. The words we use are based on words that our parents used, that their parents used, from different languages, pulled from all over the world. And the problem is that the faster you try to communicate and the more complex concepts you try to communicate, the more ambiguity you include in the language you use. Metaphor is something used to represent something else. At its pure form, that's what it is. In the context of this talk, metaphor is a framework that you're building to facilitate communication. An example is security requires safety and protection. Security also requires a willingness to slow down, stop, and assess where you are before you decide what you're going to do. Security can also involve speed, fast reactions to problems, different ways that you deal with what's going on, rapid analysis. And as you notice, these metaphors don't all work together. By choosing one metaphor, you're choosing not to use other metaphors. Now, before we get deeper into security, a little bit about metaphor itself. There's a wonderful book out there called Metaphors We Live By Lakoff and Johnson. It is probably one of the hardest books I've read in recent times. Just because you get into it, you expect a book about how we communicate, and instead you get a book on the philosophy of linguistics. So, a bit of a slog, but I got through it and started to understand what was going on. And what they talk about is one thing as something else. So this is argument as conflict. And we use this in the language we use on a daily basis. Claims, sentences like, your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument. And if you read the actual book by Lakoff and Johnson, this goes on for pages. Just supporting evidence around this way that we explain argument as conflict. Because it's an amorphous concept. The concept of argument involves all of this stuff. It's a disagreement. It's one person stating a position somebody else doesn't have. There are different ways to argue, different techniques. But by saying argument is conflict, you can wrap a bunch of stuff together and compromise by explaining the concept through more physical terms. Most people have been in a fight. probably as kids, but fighting on a playground, fighting over a toy, fighting with your brother, and arguing about the fate of the Middle East are similar in some ways. And those similarities are what allow us to use the communication of metaphor to streamline our discussion of conflict in general. Metaphor is used generally. We use it as humans. There are different ways we use it, and there's strong indication that it is the only way the human brain can think of complex thoughts, is by linking different concepts together in different ways. Specific industries use specific metaphors, because metaphors frame thoughts. And this is where groups get stuck. If you are a being that thinks of complex things in relation to less complex things and form this massive convoluted chain of complexity to understand what you're actually thinking of and trying to communicate, and you have another being doing the same thing, there is very little chance that the metaphors you're using are going to resolve in the same way in each person's brain. There's going to be misunderstanding. It's going to happen. And as you work through the misunderstanding, and everybody starts to use the same internal metaphors as well as the same linguistic metaphors, you begin to build consensus. And when you build consensus and you start to think about things in the same way, you start to form an industry. And this is great because it allows everybody to communicate better, things start to move faster, and then when the world changes around you, you can't adapt because you formed your thinking through your language. And this is where silos come from. This is why you have situations where DBAs can only talk to other DBAs. Developers don't talk to the administrators, because the language is inhibiting that process. The way our brains work is inhibiting that process. Well-chosen metaphors can promote understanding, but poorly selected metaphors will inhibit it. If you do not see an environment change coming, you cannot adapt to it. And you end up getting stuck, not just not doing the right thing, but actively doing the wrong thing. And when you extend this throughout the world, throughout the industry, and throughout time, you wind up with entire industries that create and then fall down. Has everybody heard the story of the watches? Does that mean anything to anybody? Okay, years ago, there was a country called Switzerland that made watches. They were really well known for making watches. They worked great. Who makes watches now? Almost nobody makes watches. The reason almost nobody makes watches is because Japan started doing better than Switzerland at making these little digital watches, because their concept as to what a watch was fundamentally different than what Switzerland's was. And because Japan's concept of a watch was, it's a computer, it eventually became that watches turned into this. The metaphor of tracking time shifted between cultures. And as that happened, the technology changed along with it, and an entire industry collapsed. And this happens in most industry collapses that you see. Within IT, we have a metaphor that we call APT. It was originally came from the US military because they wanted to refer to attacking entities without calling them by name. Because apparently, if you say certain countries are attacking you, certain countries attack you even more. This hit public consciousness because of a couple of reports that came out in rapid succession. And what happened metaphorically was fascinating. Because APT is a metaphor that is standing in place for the concept of nation-funded attacks. But what happened within the marketing industry is you had the metaphor of attackers as nations, which shifted into the metaphor of attackers as APT, which shifted into APT as advanced malware, which was further simplified into APT as malware, and all of a sudden, all of your anti-malware vendors became APT solutions, which didn't really make sense for those of us that knew what was going on, but it was the language that formed the thinking, which was in the people's minds that were actually buying products that caused this to happen. This was a failure of metaphor due to ad hoc metaphor mapping. One group stole a metaphor from another group repurposed it, it was stolen, repurposed, stolen, repurposed, and all of a sudden, the industry reacted in a way that was counter-effective to what it actually should have been doing. Metaphor functions also as communication accelerators. There's been a lot of research into this in linguistics, philosophy, and psychology. And I'm not going to get into the details. You can all thank me later. Basically, metaphor is not simply a replacement for factual statements. There is a way that the brain processes factual statements, and there is a way that the brain processes metaphor, and they are fundamentally different. The way metaphors are processed by the brain is intrinsic to the brain, and the brain cannot process complexity without metaphor. Has everybody heard the monkey story? The monkey brain story? Anybody? This is one of my favorite stories because it involves people sticking electrodes in people's brains. And, those stories are always fun, right? So they took these monkeys and they showed them pictures of bananas after they mapped certain parts of the brain that counted. And when they showed them one banana, the one cluster of neurons lit up. When they showed them 2 bananas, the 2 showed up. 3 bananas was 3. 4 bananas was 3, 4, and 5. And from that point on, you started getting near neurons firing. So it basically meant that, and when they extended this to other primates, it looks like primates count 1, 2, 3, 4-ish, 5-ish, looks kind of like 6. Maybe that's a 7. Wow, that's a lot of bananas. And you wind up with the brain processing metaphor, processing complex things through liking it to other things. Metaphor is therefore like a funhouse mirror, because the set of things that your brain turns into, a complex thought, and the set of things that your brain turns a complex thought into are going to be different. The same words can have different understanding. It's like the brain is using a form of lossy compression to speed understanding. Factual statements serve as a checksum, verifying your metaphors. So has anybody here seen House? Okay, good. Do you like House? Yeah. What's interesting about House is, as somebody with a physics background, what he's constantly doing through his practice is going, if this is true, that would mean this. And if what he's expecting doesn't happen, that means the original premise isn't true. He's using empirical facts to verify the complex thoughts that are going on in his head and trying to understand what's actually going on. Within regular, non-dramatic life, we do this by bouncing words back and forth. We call it a conversation. But if you're looking at a complex security situation and you're trying to say, all right, what's going on here, let's talk about it, what you do in an argument, in a discussion, is sort of bounce ideas back and forth until you've sort of formed your metaphors in one another's heads in a similar way, and you're working off of the same framework. This process works better the closer people are. The fewer gaps there are in communication between people, the easier it is. This is why we have generational gaps. My parents' metaphors are very different than mine. And when I was in my teens, they didn't work at all. You see this with class conflict. You see this with race conflict. You see it with culture conflict. You see it a lot when people from outside the U.S. come into the U.S. to work. You see it in politics. You see people that say, and actually say, all I want is a job. And another group of people saying, I don't want that person stealing my job. Because the concept of a job turned into my job because of the way people were construing this complex thought of immigrants coming to the U.S. to work. And that formed years, still going on, of debate in the political system. Fundamentally, this is an iterative process. This process of understanding, this process of communication. But it's focused on speed, and it's necessarily imperfect. For success, you have to focus on the gaps. Now, metaphors can fail, they can break down. They can be overly restrictive, and they can fail to extend. Now, I'm going to butcher his name because I've never met the man, but do you know Scott Graneman? Does anybody here actually know Scott? Okay. Scott did a project several years ago called the Security Analogy Project. It's still online. It's quite good. And he just researched and talked to a bunch of people to see how security concepts were discussed within the industry. One of the metaphors he used is denial of service attack is like a phone call. You've got a receptionist sitting at a desk that has to answer the phone every time. And every time the phone rings, she picks it up. So if you want to overwhelm the line, you simply have all of your friends call the number over and over and over again. And that's a way to explain denial of service to a management type person. Now, the original form of this metaphor was simpler. Alice, the person answering the phone wasn't a receptionist. She's Alice in the analogy online because they like to have names that start with A. But they had to extend that and turn that person into a receptionist to answer the question of why don't they just look at caller ID? Why don't they just not answer the phone? Those are points of metaphor breakdown, and you have to stretch the metaphor to make it cover that problem. Another one they use is adware as paparazzi. Because adware, if you download it, it follows you around the internet. It logs the sites you visit, the purchases you make, and the ads you look at, and it sends the info to a third party. So it's a lot like the paparazzi. But it breaks down because the paparazzi are typically not funded by overseas criminal groups that are trying to steal our financial information. Paparazzi is not usually engaged in theft. They're not sometimes compromised. They are sometimes compromised, but it's not quite the same thing, and we understand that. And we understand that because we're all security people. We all use similar metaphors, but if you try to use adware as paparazzi talking to somebody who's not in security, and you then try to say, oh, and the paparazzi are breaking into people's houses and stealing their credit cards, the person who you're talking to goes, what? That doesn't make any sense. And they stop listening to you. And that's the problem. Because when people stop listening, communication is over. Another metaphor of storage is shelves. And I quite like this one. I'd not run into this one until I ran into Scott's work. But in trying to explain how file systems work, he made this complex metaphor of it's like you have a bunch of shoeboxes on a series of shelves. And each file exists as paper. Usually, it's paper clipped in a box. But sometimes really big ones have to be spread across multiple boxes, and then if that one's deleted, you take it out, you have these boxes that are half full, so you start filling random stuff in, and it sort of extends and grows and stuff like that. And I thought that was a wonderful metaphor. A stack of papers like a file, boxes like a cluster, and you have to use this indexing complex system that can really work. So it works well, but it breaks down because you have different file formats. You can say this is like different shelving formats. ext2, ext3, NTFS, FAT32, stuff like that, all have different indexing systems. And then you have different slack space. So the metaphor sort of works as you extend it, but it starts to break down because people don't store paper anymore. The people one generation below me don't have filing cabinets. They don't need them. They scan everything in, they put it in folders. It's just not necessary. People older than me have a whole lot more filing cabinets than I have. So we're starting to see a metaphor breaking down due to age. You can also see this metaphor break down for technical reasons, because not all file systems use indexes. There are some file systems that serve as kind of like relational databases. And in that case, this metaphor doesn't apply at all. So you can really get a little confused on that. IT is rich in metaphor. We've all heard the information superhighway, right? Yeah, that's a metaphor that broke down a while ago. And it was replaced with, okay, the internet's not really an information system superhighway. It's not this load of trucks. It's more like a series of tubes, right? Yeah. That's the kind of thing we deal with, because IT is a complex industry. And it's a complex industry that's built upon an engineering industry, which is also complex, which as you go down becomes a little bit less complex, but the industry itself is increasing in complexity faster than society itself is able to handle that level of complexity. There was a project in 2008 with more people in here than I can name, but it'll come up in the notes at the end here. And their goal was to create new InfoSec metaphors. And it's a fascinating project to read because they got so many things right and they completely failed in focus. One of the metaphors, the first thing they did was they uncovered existing metaphors. So security as a fortress or a castle. We've all heard that one. You know, that one's been around forever. Security as cops and robbers is another one that's used, not quite as much, but is relatively common. And more current is security as warfare. You know, we see this in the news, we see this in the articles we read and all of this. Then they went concept mining, which is one of the most fun activities ever. And that's when they dug into other fields and said, how do these people view what we would consider security problems? They looked at the biology fields, medical fields, and economics. And came up with some interesting ideas, like the Cyber Richter scale, where you can measure and rate dangers, which is, of course, a complete failure because in earthquake world, Richter scale measures the difference between amplitudes of waves. How do you do that in security? That doesn't make any sense. So, you know, you get into this world where it's great, but we can't actually do it. They brought in the architectural metaphor, which is you have to build security in. It's not going to work if you don't build security in. We've all heard that, right? Or actually, it's the same one they use in cooking, which you have to bake it in. This fails because we're not always building something. Sometimes, to use the metaphor, we inherit this crumbling, ramshackle building, and it's like, all right, you know, we got to keep the Huns out of this. What? You can't do it. You can't always build new. They then looked at medical, and in medical, look at wellness, look at how we measure health. And that's a problem because we don't actually do that very well in medical. You know, how are we going to learn from medical? Medical can't do it yet. You know, what's the difference between a cold and a disease? You know, in the medical field, there are people who try to deal with their diabetes as if it's a cold. You know, it's like, oh, I didn't eat any carbs today, so I'm good. I can have this baked potato now. You know, it doesn't really work that way. And if we as people can't adapt to that in the medical world with our own bodies, we're not going to be able to do it in the IT world. But the better you understand metaphor, the better you can anticipate these points of breakdown. And that's where things start to get interesting. Anybody here on the paul.com mailing list? SANS advisory board in either of those lists? Okay, Matt is, a couple of other people. I ran a contest last year. I gave a talk at DerbyCon, and when you give a talk at DerbyCon, you get, I got a free ticket, but I already bought my ticket, so I had a spare ticket. And what I did was I said, you know, give me a list of metaphors. And whoever gives me the metaphor I like best, you know, completely biased contest, whoever gave me the one I like best got a free ticket to DerbyCon. And I got a nice set of about 15 metaphors to work through. I broke them all up, published them back on the list. That research is out there. So Michael Smith gave this relatively classic metaphor, but with a twist. And I quite like the twist. You know, security's like a castle. You've got walls, moats, archers, guards, drawbridges, stuff like that. Talks about passive defensive, active defenses, all of that. But it also has a secret door so people can bypass the hassle if they want to. Most castles have this. This is the core of the metaphor. Fundamentally, the problem is untrustworthy people. Attackers then are likely to focus on the people, not on the infrastructure. It doesn't matter how good your castle is. If your attacker knows where the back door is or can bribe somebody to get through it, they can bypass all security. This metaphor is useful, but it breaks down because the core is based on the concept of people are untrustworthy. If you're in an environment where people go, oh, I can trust all my people, the metaphor is not going to work. You basically hit this massive conflict of understanding because your core truth is we can't trust anybody. Their core truth is we trust everybody. You have to deal with that problem before you can talk about any other issues. Another example, Shauna gave me several good metaphors. The one I'm highlighting here is going to a doctor for the first time. There are a lot of findings which are actionable. This is the core of her metaphor. You know, the younger you are, the more you can change. Works with code, works with systems. You know, if you're not entrenched in a thing, you can change the thing more easily. Basically, security fits in at the beginning of a project, is her idea. This is the one that won for entirely biased reasons. This is a submarine metaphor. Submarines are useless without people. In order to be useful, they have to both protect the people and move them from place to place. Fundamentally, very important thing to understand in combination. Submarines have doors. You probably don't want to open the door underwater, so let's put some protections in around that. You have to keep the people in, have to keep the water out. You know, if you close the doors underwater while people are on the outside, that's probably not a good solution. You have to have a breach plan, you know, reassess the breach after exposing to water. There are just tons of insights in this analogy. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. It's a very useful metaphor. It's highly extensible, it's flexible, it's fast, it's easy to understand, and it's completely derailed by somebody who says, what's a submarine? In the US, which is a fairly militaristic culture, we know what submarines are. We have a coast. We know that. In areas of the world that are more peaceful, have less investment in war, basically, have less investment in TV, and watch less war movies, this metaphor is not going to work. Jonathan gave me a football metaphor. Okay? Sports metaphors are quite common in US business. Firewalls, defensive line, other technologies as linebackers, good code as quarterbacks, WAFs as safeties, SOC as coaches, and lead as defensive coordinators. Like the submarine analogy, this one's very flexible. Like the submarine analogy, this one's totally useless if you don't understand football. I have never understood football. I've tried. I've had friends invite me over for the Super Bowl. They explain it to me every year. I watch the commercials. I glaze over when the actual game's going on. Until I got this analogy from Jonathan, I had no idea what cornerbacks and safeties did. This is what I understood of the metaphor. For me, it worked backwards. The metaphor helped me understand football by explaining it to me. To be successful, metaphors have to be selective. They exist to facilitate communication. The introduction of metaphors should decrease complexity, which gets us to incident response. In incident management, we focus on the technical. We can't avoid this. Fundamentally, it's a technical problem that resulted in a technical attack being successful. We have to understand what happened so we can reverse it and prevent it. Implementing a new defense requires communication. You have to communicate with your boss or your suppliers to acquire new tech, with board members and executives to increase budget, and you have to be able to spin the event through media. There are other industries that are quite good at these things. PR firms exist to spin and frame disasters. That's their job. Finance and insurance firms discuss risk, and rapid-fire technical development is well known in startups. You know, they're really, really good at this. But in IT in general, we're still learning. And quite frankly, we're bad at a lot of this. This is an example of metaphor used by Apache.org. I went with open source organizations on the analysis because their reports are available. I can't share my own clients' reports. Other organizations are not going to share their reports until they've been cleaned up and basically stripped out of anything useful to me. So, in 2008, there was a privilege escalation attack against ApacheCon.com. And there was this big banner put on the report. Basically, no code or users at risk. The focus of the metaphor is on intrusion as physical attack. That's what everything is couched as. It's a good metaphor, but it's misleading. Because if you break into a system and you copy data, it's not really the same thing as theft. You know, we see this in the piracy debate going on. It's like, yeah, you stole it, but I still have it, so you didn't really steal it. What you did was you made it harder, maybe, for me to sell this to other people, possibly. And you get this really fuzzy thing going on because the metaphor we use does not reflect reality. The language they used in this report, that they say the logs were destroyed. Okay? You know how to destroy a log? Like a physical log, you destroy with a chainsaw, right? And it's gone. or a beeper, if you have a beeper. In this case, they have a string of bits. And the string of bits were modified in some way. Maybe inodes were deleted, but whatever. But made inaccessible with the skill that the Apache organization had. That's what they mean. We all know that the solution to this problem is log redundancy. You have some sort of log offsite system, all this sort of stuff. It's what we call standard practice. And what Apache is saying is it was destroyed, which basically means we weren't following standard practice and we had a problem and it's their fault. And you have to step back and go, wait a minute, that doesn't really work for me. But things got better. In 2010, they had a problem with Jira and Confluence. They had a donated instance that was popped by an attacker. And this banner said, suffered a direct targeted attack. Things get very, very interesting here. Because in this case, the only thing Apache did wrong was not patch as quickly as they should have. We all have experienced that. But by saying suffered a direct targeted attack, they're using victim language. And you get into victim blaming and attacker blaming. And we see this in the news a lot, well outside of information security. And I don't really want to bring up all of that stuff that's going on. It's been in the news. We don't have to all relive it. But the problem is that when you use victim language, the discussion shifts to responsibility. And when you have discussions of responsibility, that's tied up in concepts of culture. Because different cultures have different concepts as to what responsibility is, what makes sense. Victim as blameless is a metaphor we use a lot in the news. As a culture, we're trying to move into a world where the attackers are blamed and the victim is not. Okay? It makes a lot of sense as humans in a society to frame attacks in this way. But in IT, it's different. And the reason it's different is attackers are not in our community. Victim language functions through shame. It shames the attackers into not doing what you don't want them to do through social pressure. If you are not in a position as a culture to place social pressure on the attackers, all victim-based language does is start a responsibility discussion that will never end because there is no solution. In IT, attackers are anonymous, and attacker shaming fails. It's hard to match the truth to the fiction in this case. So this is a metaphor that, while technically true, should probably have been avoided. In 2012, the last one of the Apache attacks, there was a configuration error, and they found passwords were leaked in the logs. You go to the logs, you go, hey, every time somebody fails a password, the failed password is in here, you can guess from that, blah, blah, blah. Now, what's interesting here, the logs that were exposed were the centralized logs they put in place to fix the problem in 2009. And they misconfigured that problem. And now, this was a zero loss incident. The language used, there was no banner, there was no excuses, purely technical, because it was a different audience. If you don't suffer a loss, you don't expect other people from outside your field to come and look. You just want to assure your own user group that, hey, things are okay. So much less metaphor, far more technical discussion. The last example here is FreeBSD. In 2012, the development and distribution platform was compromised. And their response was extremely technical, one of the most technical incident reports I've seen. They anticipated a shared background with the people to whom they were communicating. There's almost no metaphor because there's almost no gap. The people that use FreeBSD and the people that develop FreeBSD are almost entirely the same user group. There's no gap that needs to be bridged. There's no cultural gap. There's no generational gap. Most people are the same age. Most people understand what's going on. FreeBSD can get away with this because the user group is so tight and so small, it works. Do you think Apple could get away with this language? It's the same BSD core, sort of. Metaphors have to consider the audience. Ad hoc metaphors are a crapshoot. They're nonsensical because of a lack of shared experience. They can fail because they overlap with existing metaphors, or they can conflict with existing metaphors. The difference between overlap causes confusion. A conflict causes active miscommunication and diametric opposition. And the solution to this problem is to pre-select your metaphors to speed understanding. Forrester released a paper a while ago called Planning for Failure. Anybody read that? Okay. Anybody generally read Forrester papers? All right. This paper, like most papers from the big, well-known think tanks, is not terribly useful with brand new data. You know, you get these papers out for business reasons. You don't actually get them out to change the industry. But one little nugget that was in there that was great was they broke down the sorts of people you have to communicate with in a disaster into groups. One group is all employees. And in all employees, there's little shared background. So you have to use cultural metaphors, things people have in common. So things like a school. You know, most people go to school, so you can use security as learning. And that's going to resonate with a lot of people. Most people have families, which work well with security as protection. A lot of people have vehicles and homes, which you can use security as maintenance. You know, tying that in. You know, maintaining our intrusion protection system is like putting oil changes in our car. We have to look at it on a regular basis. Most people have finances, so security as resource management works well. Now, within IT, it's different. In an IT group, you have significant amounts of shared background, and where people tend to have gaps, you have technical gaps, which means you have remapping problems. Suppose you're a Linux expert in a room full of Windows experts. You have to be able to know enough about Windows to translate what you're talking about as you talk to them. You know, denial of service attack can be likened to a runaway process. If you're a network engineer talking to a bunch of people that are Windows system people. Remote code execution can be likened to staying logged in. I've done this myself when I was working with somebody that had a mainframe and a bunch of terminals going around. It's like, well, somebody broke in. Well, actually, it's like they sat down at a terminal somebody hadn't logged out of. And the problem is, the system you're using never logs anybody out. When you couch it in those terms, people see the problem, they can fix it. Communications groups, your PR people, are good at selecting metaphors. So when you communicate with them, you can fall back and say, hey, you're like all employees. We'll just use our general metaphors and let them translate, because that's their skill set. Another one of Forrester's groups was law enforcement. Law enforcement is an isolated culture. Let's use the FBI as an example. Does anybody here work directly with the FBI? Okay. Leave your hands up if you like them. Okay. Anybody here not like the FBI? Okay. What's interesting, and a lot of people don't want to raise their hands for that particular question, if there's an FBI person in the audience. A lot of people have a negative opinion of the FBI, because what we know of the FBI comes through the media. It's filtered through a gap, and then communicated to us across another gap. Every interaction I've had with the FBI has been utterly wonderful. I've worked with several agents. They're all amazing, driven, wonderful people. All of them. And after having worked with them for a period of time, I was shocked that they still have this massive image problem. And culture, secrecy, poor communication, all of that. There are reasons for that. They, as a bureaucratic organization, they have done some pretty stupid things. But the fact that we have, as a culture, this negative concept around law enforcement in general is indicative of a massive communication problem. If you're communicating with law enforcement, know that they're isolated. Know that they work with bad people on a regular basis. It's easy for them to make the leap to go, most people are bad, whereas in our world, we tend to think most people are good. So that's a gap that has to be crossed. Unless you know otherwise, assume they're non-technical. You can have productive conversations around why it matters. Metaphors that work really well. Security is protection, security is damage, and security is capture and retrieval. Okay? That's what they do on a regular basis. So when you couch in those terms, it works a lot better than I'm seeing something weird on the network. Because they're not going to care about that. They're trying to put pedophiles behind bars. They don't care what your network is doing. Similar problems happen with peer incident response teams. If you're working with other companies that have their own incident response teams you have to communicate, it's like IT, but there's a wider gap. So what you need to do is take some time to understand their background. Map their experience, understand what technology they're used to, so you can communicate to them in their ways. Different business units have different areas of focus. So you're going to have different metaphor maps for individual business units. This is where stereotypes really work well. Finance groups, talking to accounting, security as loss works great. Service groups look at security as customer damage. If you're talking to help desk about a problem, don't talk about the servers. Help desk doesn't care about the servers. They don't work with servers every day. They work with people. Talk about how the problem affects the people they're there to serve. External service providers, similar but slightly different. And the difference is they're obsessed with blame. Their business model is based on providing a higher quality of service at a lower cost. Anything that attacks that model causes them pain, so they try to deflect. In these models, blame risks the business, so they have very strong incentives to avoid the blame. You get metaphor conflict, you get people avoiding communication, you get security trying to, security functioning as blame. So use security as blame only if the blame does not rest on the provider. Otherwise, use security as discovery. Say, we're trying to figure out what happened. It's like, I'm lost in the woods. Can you help me find a way out? They're service organizations. They exist to help you. So frame everything in terms of helping me to help us as a group together, not as prove to me you didn't do it. Because if you do the latter, they're going to fight. If you do the former, they're going to work with you. And finally, external investigators are like law enforcement, except they're not focused on protection or on capture. They're focused a lot on blame. They're focused on security as damage and security as punishment. So avoid security as blame metaphors with them. In particular, avoid security as damage with them. Because if you trigger their hot buttons, all of a sudden you're going to have a second incident to deal with. Now, all industries have their own metaphors. After all, that's why they're industries. Remember, metaphor forms thought, thought forms metaphor, so you get this cycle. Within an industry, you can't do a complete map. You have limited time, you have limited knowledge. So, a few observations. If this doesn't match your industry, dig deeper in your industry to understand how thought processes work there. Manufacturing industries tend to use process-based metaphors or flow-based metaphors. We have to keep the work moving. It's kinds of things they say. We can't stop the line. In the medical world, they look at patient risk and patient improvement. So security as, heartbeats are something they look at. You see in the movies, all those little charts that show, from your perspective, go that way with it. The heartbeat lines and things like that. So you need to say, we're improving, our network is sick, we're working on it. Antivirus as flu shots is an analogy that works really well in the medical world and works pretty horribly in the homeschooling world. You've got choices there. Speaking of homeschooling, in education, student safety is a good metaphor to use, as is learning. In schools, security is less tight. And it's less tight for many reasons. One reason is making mistakes is how people learn. And if you tighten things down so people don't make mistakes, they're not going to learn. Faculty understands this, even if they don't think about it that way, and they react against the restrictions on flexibility because it limits their learning abilities. In the transportation world and in communications, security is availability, security is understanding. Those metaphors work well. For other organizations, there's a book called Images of Organization by Gareth Morgan, and that one's not nearly as much of a slog as the Metaphors We Live By, but it is thick. It's a big book, but it is packed full of insights. And what he does is map metaphors to organization types. So he says there are machine metaphors, which look at processes, tasks, and precision. There are organism metaphors that look at growth, depth, ecology, and resources. I encountered those metaphors a lot in the small business space. There's brain-based organisms looking at learning and at self-organization. We see that a lot in the agile development spaces. There are cultural metaphors looking at hierarchy and design, and political metaphors looking at power, goals, and individual benefit. Those ones work a lot in nonprofit organizations. So these different organizations think of things in different ways. You also get lifestyle metaphors. These are studied by social engineers to simplify greatly the work that other social engineers have done. You have to look at people's age, because generations communicate better within their own generation than outside of the generation. You look at race, language choices, prejudices, things like that. You look at class, which brings economic options, societal expectations with it. And you can look at hobbies. If you can identify a person's hobby, you can use metaphors around baseball, cooking, photography, whatever the case may be. The summary of all of this is people understand best what they already know. And if you can understand what they know and communicate with them, you can do better. So if you're talking to like a baseball fan, learn a little bit about the game. Talking to a football fan, give up because it's incomprehensible. Talking to a fishing fan, learn a bit about fishing. Talking to a chef, learn a little about food prep. People will not attempt to understand you if you do not attempt to understand them. One trick you can use is what's used in agile development, and that is the personas. Specific personas defined before an event can help you determine the language to use in communicating the event. This can identify and define applications and systems, how to design them, how they're going to be worked with. Names help, generalities help, but specifics help more. Now, you have to be careful with stereotypes. Stereotypes are another form of lossy compression the brain uses. They're very valuable, they speed things up, but they get you in trouble because they can trap real people in fake boxes. And if that starts to happen, you have to recognize my stereotype is getting in the way, drop it, build something new. Use them, but only if it helps you understand. Because if you try to match a person to a stereotype, it's going to fail in life and in security. So, 3 examples and I'm done. We can talk about George. George is white, college-educated, 50-year-old bank manager. He uses his computer mostly for email and web browsing. He's divorced with his amicable. They just grew apart. He's got 3 kids. One is starting a family. There's 1 grandchild. One is in college. One is still living at home. George does like to grill outside on nice days. He attends church, but not regularly. He's dating a woman 15 years his younger, which may have been a reason for the divorce. Played basketball in college, has fond memories of it. Votes regularly, usually Republican, and he's renting a house as his ex-wife kept his first house. So what does this mean? This means for languages. Security is learning because he went to college. He'll understand that. Security is doing what's right. He's driven by family and conservative values. Security from a cooking perspective. Look at cooking steaks. It's not done yet, it's still bloody. Cooking fish, slightly different, but both part of the grilling metaphor. Security is basketball, again, likening back to his college experience. And security is protection, again, going back to his family experience. Another person is Dana. Dana's black, college educated, skilled with computers, but is end user only. She's a 23-year-old insurance agent. She tends to be entrepreneurial, running her own party planning business. She likes to date, but it's not serious. She has some credit card debt due to youth, and she regrets the debt, but not necessarily what she did to you. She's very religious, attends Christian church every Sunday, volunteers at the church, also volunteers at Big Brothers Big Sisters, votes occasionally, but always Democratic, dislikes sports, but likes to read, mostly mysteries. So this tells you, security is self-improvement. This is culture and college-based metaphor. Security is risk. Entrepreneurs respond well to those. Security is duty, works well with religious people. Security is learning. She likes to read, she did go to college. Security is discovery, because she likes to read mysteries. And security is helping others. She's a Democrat, she likes to do volunteer work. Any issues couched in those terms, likely to resonate, going to make the communication flow a lot better. Last person. Tommy is second generation Vietnamese high school educated, highly skilled with computers and self-taught. He's a 35-year-old database administrator. He has a longtime boyfriend, but despite what happened yesterday, no plans to legally marry him. Not involved politically, lives with 2 dogs. Technically, he's Buddhist, but not very serious about it. Financially stable, saving for retirement, learns about 1 computer language per year. Plays online role-playing games in his spare time, but he actively avoided business throughout his entire career. He's thought by managers to be abrasive in meetings, but loved by the technical staff because he really speeds the problem-solving process. Tommy's metaphors would be security is learning. He's very self-motivated. That's going to resonate very well. Avoid security as education. He did not go to college. He would not respond well to that. Focus on technology analogies. Linux security is Microsoft security. Document security is data security will work well. Security is care, because he has pets. That works very well. And security is improvement, because he likes technology. Technology is constantly improving. That resonates well with technological people. This is the further reading. I will put the slide back up if you like, but those are the primary works I use for the paper that's coming out soon. There's twice as many in the actual paper, but those are the ones that matter. For those that like this kind of thing, I mentioned the comic book. You can scan this code, download your own copy of the comic book. You can come by the booth, I can show it to you. This isn't of this talk yet, but we'll get there. And, okay. I generally wait till I see the phones go down before I go to the next slide. While I wait for the phones to go down, any questions? Really? Have I stunned you all into silence? Was this the talk you were expecting? Anybody sadly disappointed? Okay, looks like they're down. This is my contact info. Ask me questions now, catch me later. I'll be here today, I'll be here tomorrow. We're having a lunch event where we explore some of the lean security stuff that I do that Matt's going to be talking about, I assume, tomorrow. And thank you.